All right, so chapter 7 of Prince Caspian. Old Narnia in danger. The place where they had met the fawns was, of course, the dancing lawn itself. Here Caspian and his friends remained until the night of the Great Council. To sleep under the stars, to drink nothing but well water, and to live chiefly on nuts and wild fruit was a strange experience for Caspian. After his bed with silken sheets and tapestried in a chamber at the castle, with meals laid out on gold and silver dishes in the anteroom, and the attendants ready at his call. But he had never enjoyed himself more. Never had sleep been more refreshing or food tasted more savory. He had began looking already to harden and wore his face in a kinglier look. When the great night came, his various strange subjects came stealing into the lawn by ones or twos, threes by sixes, sometimes sevens. The moon then shining almost at her full, and his heart swelled as he saw their numbers and heard their greetings. All whom he had met were there, the bugly bears, red dwarfs, black dwarfs, moles, badgers, hares, hedgehogs, others whom he had not yet seen. 5 satyrs, red as foxes, the whole contingent of talking mice, armed with teeth, following a shrill trumpet, some owls, the old raven of Ravensar, and last of all, this took Caspian's breath away. With the centaurs came a genuine giant Wimblewether of Deadman's Hill, carrying his back a basket full of rather seasick dwarfs, who had accepted his offer of a lift and were now wishing they had walked instead. The Bugly Bears were very anxious to have the feast first and leave the council till afterwards, perhaps until tomorrow. Reap Cheap and his mice said that councils and feasts could both wait and proposed storming Miraz in his own castle that night. Twig and the other squirrels said they could talk and eat at the same time, so why not have the council and the feast all at once? The moles proposed throwing up entrenchments around the lawn before they did anything else. The fawns thought it would be better to begin with a solemn dance. The old raven, while agreeing with the bears that it would take too long to have a full council before supper, begged to be allowed to give a brief address to the whole company. But Caspian and the centaurs and the dwarfs overruled all these suggestions and insisted on holding a real council of war at once. When all the other creatures had been persuaded to sit down quietly in a great circle, and when with more difficulty they got Twig to stop running to and fro, saying, "Silence, silence, everyone, silence for the king's speech," Caspian felt very nervous, got up and said, "Narnians," he began, but he never got any further, for at that very moment Camilla the hare said, "Shh, there's a man somewhere near." They were all creatures of the wild, accustomed to be hunted, and they become as still as statues. The beasts all turned their noses in different directions, which Camillo had indicated. "Smells like a man, but yet not quite like a man," whispered Truffle Hunter. "It's getting nearer," said Camilla. 2 badgers and 3 dwarfs, with your bows at the ready. Go softly and meet it," said Caspian. "We'll settle him," said the black dwarf grimly. "Don't shoot it if it's alone," said Caspian. "Catch it." "Why?" asked the dwarf. "Do as you're told," said Glenstorm the centaur. Everyone waited in silence while the 3 dwarfs and 2 badgers trotted stealthily across the lawn to the trees on the northwest side. Then came a sharp dwarfish cry, "Stop! Who goes there?" Then a sudden spring. A moment later, a voice, which Caspian knew well, could be heard saying, all right, I'm unarmed. Take my risks if you like. Worthy badgers, don't bite right through them. I want to speak to the king." "Dr. Cornelius!" cried Caspian with joy and rushed forward to meet his old tutor. Everyone else crowded around. "Ugh, a renegade dwarf," said Knickerbrick. "A half-heifer. Shall I pass my sword through its throat?" "Be quiet, Knickerbrick," said Trumpkin. "The creature can't help its ancestry. This is my greatest friend and the savior of my life. Anyone who doesn't like his company may leave my army at once. Dearest doctor, I'm glad to see you again. However did you find us?" "By a little use of simple magic, your majesty," said the doctor, who was still puffing and blowing from having walked so fast. "But there's no time to go into that now. We must all fly from this place at once. You're already betrayed, and Miraz is on the move. Before midday tomorrow, you'll be surrounded." "Betrayed by who?" said Caspian. "Another renegade dwarf, no doubt," said Knickerbrick. "By your horse Dressdrewer," said Dr. Cornelius. "The poor brute knew no better. When you were knocked off, of course he went dawdling back to his stable in the castle, and then the secret of your flight was known. I made myself scarce, having no wish to be questioned about it in Miraz's torture chamber. I had a pretty good guess from my crystal as to where I should find you, but all day, and that was the day before yesterday, I saw Miraz's tracking parties out in the woods. Yesterday I learned that his army's out. I don't think some of your purebred dwarfs have been as much woodcraft as you might be expected. You left tracks all over the place. Great carelessness. At any rate, something has warned Miraz that old Narnia is not so dead as he had hoped, and he is on the move." "Hurrah!" said a little shrill and small voice from somewhere at the doctor's feet. "Let him come. All I ask is the king will put me and my people in front." "What on earth?" said Dr. Cornelius. "Has your majesty got grasshoppers or mosquitoes in your army?" And then after stooping down and peering carefully through his spectacles, he broke into a laugh. "By the lion, it's a mouse! Senor Mouse, I desire your better acquaintance. I am honored by meeting such a valiant beast." "My friendship you will have, learned man," said Reepicheep, "and any dwarf or giant in the army who does not give you good language shall have my sword to reckon with." "Is there time for this foolery?" asked Knickerbock. "What are our plans, battle or flight?" "Battle if need be," said Trumpkin, "but we are ready for it. We're hardly ready for it yet. This is not a very defensible place." "I don't like the idea of running away," said Caspian. Hear him," said the Bugly Bears. "Whatever we do, let's not have any running, especially not before supper, and not too soon after supper either." "Those who run first do not always run last," said the Centaur, "and why should we not let the enemy choose our position instead of choosing it ourselves? Let us find a strong place." "That's wise, your majesty, that's wise," said Truffle Hunter. "But where do we go? Your majesty, and all you variety of creatures, I think we must fly east and down the river to the great woods. The Telmarines hate that region. They've always been afraid of the sea, and something about that might come over the sea. That's why they've let the great woods grow up. If traditions speak true, an ancient Carparvel was at the river mouth, and all that part is friendly to us and hateful to our enemies. We must go to Aslan's Howe." "Aslan's House," said several voices. "We don't know what that is." "It lies within the skirts of the great woods, and is a huge mound which the Narnians raised in very ancient times to cover a very magical place, where there stood, and perhaps still stands, a very magical stone. The mound is all hollowed out within magical galleries and caves. The stone is at the central cave of it all. There's a room in the mound for all of our stores, and all of us who have the most need of cover and are most accustomed to underground life can be lodged in caves. The rest of us can lie in the wood. At a pinch, all of us, except this worthy giant, could retreat into the mound itself. There we should be beyond reach of every danger except famine." "It's a good thing we have a learned man among us," said Truffle Hunter, but Trumpkin muttered under his breath, "Soup and celery. I wish our leaders would think less about these old wives' tales and more about victuals and arms." But all approved of Cornelius's proposal, and that very night, half an hour later, they were on the march. Before sunrise, they arrived at Aslan's Howe. Aslan's Howe is where the stone table is. Do you remember from the first book, or the second book? So the stone table, they built a mountain, like a hill around it. So it's like a cave now that you can like walk into, and the stone table's in there. So that's what they're talking about when they're talking about Aslan's Howe. It was certainly an awesome place. A round green hill on top of another hill, long since grown over with trees, and one little doorway leading into it. The tunnels inside were a perfect maze until you got to know them, and then they were lined in roofs, smooth stones, and on the stones peering in the twilight. Caspian saw strange characters and snaky patterns. Pictures of the form of the lion was repeated again and again. It all seemed to belong to an even older Narnia than Narnia, which his nurse had told him. It was after that they had taken up their quarters, and around the Howe, the fortune began to turn against them. Miras's scouts soon found their new lair. He and his army arrived at the edge of the woods. As so often happens, the enemy turned out stronger than they had hoped. Caspian's heart sank as he saw the company after company arriving. And though Miras's men may have been afraid of going in the wood, they were even more afraid of Miraz, and with him in command, they carried battle deeply into it, and sometimes almost to the Howe itself. Caspian and the other captains, of course, made many sorties into the open country. Thus, there was fighting on most days, and sometimes by night as well, but Caspian's party had on the whole the worst of it. At last there came a night where everything had gone as badly as possible. The rain, which had been falling heavily all day, ceased at nightfall, only to give place to a raw cold. The next morning Caspian arranged what was his biggest battle yet, and had hung all hopes on it. He with most of the dwarfs had fallen into the king's right wind at daybreak, and then whether they were heavily engaged, giant Wimblewether with the centaurs came with some of the fiercest beasts who had broken out from another place to devoured to cut the kings right off from the rest of the army, but it failed. No one had warned Caspian, because no one in these later days of Narnia remembered giants are not at all clever. Poor Wimblewether, though as brave as he, a lion and a true giant in that respect, had broken out the wrong time from the wrong place, and his party and Caspian's had suffered badly and done the enemy little harm. The best of the bears had been hurt, a centaur terribly wounded, and there were a few of Caspian's party who had not lost blood. It was a gloomy company that huddled together under the dripping trees to eat their scanty supper. The gloomiest of all was giant Wimblewether. He knew it was all his fault. He sat in silence, shedding big tears, which collected at the end of his nose and then fell off with a huge splash on the whole group of the mice, who had just been beginning to get warm and drowsy. They all jumped up, shaking the water out of their ears, wringing their little blankets, and asked the giant in shrill but forcible voices whether he thought they weren't wet enough without this sort of thing. And then other people woke up and told the mice they had been enrolled as scouts and could not keep a concert party, and that's why they couldn't keep quiet. And Wimblewether tiptoed away to find a place where he could be measurable in peace. and stepped on somebody's tail, and somebody said after it was a fox, bit him, and so everyone was all sorts of grumpy. But in the secret magical chamber of the How, Caspian and Cornelius and the Badger and Knickerbock and Trumpkin were at council. Thick pillars of ancient workmanship supported the roof, and in the center the stone itself, a stone table split right down the center, and covered with what had once been writing of some kind, but ages of wind and rain and snow had almost worn away the old times, when the stone table stood at the hilltop, and the mound had not yet been built above it. They were not using the table or sitting round it. It was too magical for common use. They sat on logs a little way away from it. Between them was a rough wooden table on which stood a rude... Oh, excuse me, guys, I'm sorry. Clay lamp lighting their pale faces, throwing big shadows on the wall. If your majesty is ever to use the horn, I think the time has come, said Truffle Hunter. Caspian, of course, had told him about this treasure several days ago. We are certainly in great need, said Caspian. But is it hard to be sure if we're at our greatest? Supposing there came an even worse need, and we have already used it. By that argument, said Knickerbock, your majesty would never use it until it was too late. I agree with that, said Dr. Cornelius. And what do you think, said Trumpkin, asked Caspian. Oh, as for me, said the Red Dwarf, your majesty knows what I think of the horn, and that bit of broken stone over there, and your great King Peter, and your lion, and Aslan are all eggs, but it's one to you when your majesty blows the horn. All I insist is that your army isn't told nothing about it. There's no good raising hopes of magical help, as I think that they're sure to be disappointed. Then the name of Aslan will wind Susan Horn. There's one thing, sire, said Dr. Cornelius, that perhaps should be done first. We do not know what form the help will take. It might call Aslan himself from over the sea, but I think it's more likely to call Peter the High King and his mighty consorts down from the high past. But in either case, we cannot expect to be sure that the help will come to this very spot. You never said a true word, said Trumpkin. I think, went on the learned man, that they or he will come back to one or the other ancient places in Narnia. This, where we now sit, is the most ancient, most deeply magical of all. And here I think the answer is the most likeliest to come, but there are two others. One is Lantern Waste, upriver, west of Beaver's Dam, where the royal children first appeared in Narnia, as records tell. The other is down the river mouth, where the castle at Carperville once stood. If Aslan himself comes, that would be the best place for meeting him too, for every story says that he's great emperor over the sea, and the sea he will pass. I should like to send messengers to both places, to Lantern Waste and the river mouth, to receive them, or him, or it. Just as I thought, the first result of this foolery is not to bring us help, but to lose 2 fighters. Who would you think of sending, Dr. Cornelius, asked Caspian. Squirrels are the best for getting through the enemy country without being caught, said Truffle Hunter. All our squirrels, we haven't had any, said Knickerbock, are rather flighty. The only one I would trust on a job like that would be Pattertwig. Let it be Pattertwig then. And who for our other messenger? I know you'd go, Truffle Hunter, but you don't have the speed, nor you, Dr. Cornelius. I won't go. With all these humans and beasts about, there must be a dwarf here. That to see that the dwarfs are fairly treated, said Knickerbock. Thimbles and thunderstorms, cried Trumpkin. Is that how you speak to the king? Send me, sire. I'll go. But I thought you didn't believe in the horn, Trumpkin, said Caspian. No, I don't, your majesty, but what's that got to do with it? I might as well die on wild goose chases, die here. You are my king, and I know the difference between giving advice and taking orders. You've had my advice, and now it's time for the orders. I'll never forget this, Trumpkin, said Caspian. Send for Pattertwig, one of you, and then who shall I blow the horn? I'd wait for the sunrise, your majesty. That sometimes has an effect on the operations in white magic. A few minutes later, Pattertwig arrived, and they had his task explained to him, and he was, like many squirrels, full of courage and a dash of energy and excitement, and mischief, too. He no sooner heard it than was eager to be off. It was arranged that he should run for Lantern Waste, while Trumpkin made the shorter journey to the river mouth. After a hasty meal, they both set off, with fervent thanks and good wishes of the king, the Badger, and Cornelius.